Cool. Cool. Well, let's see if this actually worked. Well, would you look at that? Cool. Alright guys, so my name is Chance, and I'm responsible for doing a lot of the work here on World Tree. Now that I know we are officially live here, just want to let you know kind of what's going on. So what I'm planning on doing is, more so because I'm going to be doing it anyways, I'm just going to be doing a lot of my research here on stream. So if you want to participate or chime in or ask any questions, feel free to do so and keep me a little bit of company while I work here. That'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And yeah, I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively quickly here. But on the off chance that I don't, it'll be a nice little experiment in any case. I'm going to listen to myself a little bit here and just make sure my audio quality is okay. That'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And yeah, I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively a little bit quieter than I was hoping. On the off chance that I don't, it'll be a nice little experiment. Something I'll probably have to work on throughout. I'm going to listen to myself a little bit here and just make sure my audio quality is okay. Background muttering there as I was watching myself. Wow, that'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And yeah, I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively a little bit quieter than I was hoping. On the off chance that I don't, it'll be a nice little experiment in any case. I'm going to listen to myself a little bit here, just make sure my audio quality is okay. Background muttering there as I was watching myself. Wow, that'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And yeah, I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively a little bit quieter than I was hoping. The off chance that I don't, it'll be a nice little experiment in any case. I'm going to listen to myself a little bit here, just make sure my audio quality is okay. Background muttering there as I was watching myself. That'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And yeah, I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively a little bit quieter than I was hoping. The off chance that I don't, it'll be a nice little experiment in any case. So I'm going to listen to myself a little bit here, just make sure my audio quality is okay. Background muttering there as I was watching myself. That'd be much appreciated. You know, I think it'll be a good way to get to know the community and everything else. And I apologize if this first stream is a little bit clunky. It's really my first time going live doing something like this, so hopefully I'll adjust to it relatively a little bit quieter than I was hoping. And a lot of senses that you don't quite literally use around the same time. And a lot of the work play off I'm still of the philosophy watching myself appreciated. However, I will admit between Iliad and this first stream Odyssey, Homer definitely contributes more of his history to make reads as a whole. Although, in a way, the sense that Homer before his stream is kind of funny how his life is interpreted in modern era. So scroll down a little bit. So there are a lot of schools of thought around Homer, and they range on subjects. And there are those that believe that his work is meant to be interpreted in a literal whole story is meant to describe money. And that's the kind of conversation on his work, but on his person, it's like the debate is who he actually was, or whether or not he existed at all. I believe he existed. I believe he was a fairly smart and wise person who always did not. The scope of his work is heavily debated in the community to this current day, where some people believe he was kind of a traveling bard or a minstrel or something of that fashion, and he went around telling these stories orally, and eventually someone wrote them down and added to them. People progressively added to them until the Iliad and the Odyssey exist in the modern era. And I'm sure there's some of that took place. They are both epics, after all, and epics are usually written by multiple people. A lot of that is because of their length, but a lot of that is also because they've been around for thousands of years, traveling popular, told, translated, and translated. So it only makes sense that throughout the literally thousands of years that took place, you would have some discrepancies between versions, and those discrepancies would be some of the people who wrote them, which in turn would fold them into the ever-growing list of authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey, respectively. It's a very cool history, and it is funny, it's like the debate at its core is, firstly, did he even exist, which is kind of funny because if Homer was watching this whole play out from whatever afterlife, I believe that it would be kind of offensive a little bit to have all these people that claim to be intelligent and claim to speak for the masses debate your existence. That's pretty funny. And then the second debate is basically whether or not he was some bar-hopping lowlife or one of the greatest poets to ever live. It's so polarizing, My own personal take on it is just kind of funny because, I've watched this laid the foundation for the Iliad and the Odyssey, respectively. And some people are quite different culture and intent as a whole. Do I think his works were added on to and edited in the future? Yeah, of course, it's crazy not to. Like most people, do I think maybe he didn't always practice what he preaches? Maybe, the same thing can be said for it's so polarizing, maybe, and that it isn't ever even in modern times. So, I'm not a huge fan of reviewing the moral deeds of ancient people through the lens of the modern day or compass. Do I think a bad word for that? Just gonna edit these on the crazy not cool. Yeah, those northern line, Jason, that always practice with the bridge. Let's get started here. In case you're wondering how I typically do these scripts, what I have is a Google Drive, and here's every video I kind of want to get done this year, hopefully. But even if I can get done, probably maybe 50 of them, I'll be pretty happy. As I mentioned at the beginning of the screen, we're going to be skipping the Red Scare for now, and theology respectively. So instead of focusing on these historical events and legends and stories we're really just going to be focusing on historical figures first. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first being it's very difficult to talk about historical events without talking about the historical things that led up to them, especially when you're dealing with complicated events. It helps to understand the players involved before you try to understand the game itself. So it's, I don't know, at least it feels that way. Also, I find it easier to talk about. The animation is a lot easier for them as well, so maybe we get more of them done. And in general, it seems to me that is the best way to do it. And I enjoy it. A lot of these events are very complicated, and a lot of them are still kind of being discussed today. Complicated events, it helps to understand players involved, how to try to I'll just talk about it briefly. I'm going to do them every day. More so just to make sure I'm actually doing all the research I need to do. Secondarily, it'll be a good way to get to know all of those. I think are still kind of being discussed today. And I work typically most days at 9 on my time, on Mountain Standard Time. So if I do all of the changes, so yeah, for 9:30 start, which should be fine. Yeah, and as for the live streams itself, that'll be good for the channel too. Or at least it will kind of show like daily uploads almost. Let's start learning about Homer. I heard this with the page earlier today, but I'll read it for you guys, I suppose. Homer was an ancient Greek author and epic poet. He is the reputed author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two epic poems that are foundational works of the Greek, of ancient Greek literature. He is regarded as one of the greatest and most influential authors of all time. And then they cite Virgil, in the Divine Comedy, which we will be covering in a future video. Refers to him as the poet sovereign and of all poets. In the preface of his translation of the Iliad, Alexander Pope acknowledges that Homer has always been considered the greatest of poets. The Iliad is set during the Trojan War, which will time. The 10-year siege in the city of Troy by coalition of the Senior and the Divine Comedy. It focuses on a quarrel between King Agamemnon and the warrior Achilles, lasting a few weeks during the last year of the war. The Odyssey focuses on the 10-year journey of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, after the fall of Troy. The Homeric epics were the greatest influence on ancient Greek culture and education to Plato. Homer was simply the one who has taught Greece, and I will likely be putting that, so for the videos, at least for the template I want to stick with for so the template I'm using to do historical figures, I like to have like one of those videos, the Homer was Hesiod, the greatest Greek culture, and he who makes the voice. Homer is kind of what he was known as, and so for Homer, so it is a little bit clickbait, but I think greatest of poets. So the template probably worked good for me. I like to have, I understand nobody else is watching this, but technically me, I guess, so but I do think that would work for me. From antiquity to present day, the influence of Homer epic it is a little bit inspired many of its most famous works, literature, music, art, and film. Much of that is still true to the common day, or to the current day. The question of by whom, when, where, and under what circumstances the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed continues to be debated. Some scholars consider that the two works were written by different authors. It is generally accepted that the poems were composed at some point around the late 8th to early 7th century BC, which is around the same time Hesiod. Many accounts of Homer's life circulated in classical antiquity, the most widespread being that he was a blind bard from Ionia, a region of coastal Anatolia in present-day Turkey. Modern scholars consider these accounts legendary. The poems are in Homeric Greek, also epic Greek, a literary language that shows a mix of features of the Ionic Aeolic dialects from different centuries. The predominant influence is Eastern Ionia, a region of coastal. Most research believes that the poems were originally translated from the original translation sides of the same coin, at least in more ways than not. So to be honest, their works, they intermesh pretty well. So I don't think I'll know if their feelings were towards each other, even if they had any, but a lot of that, not really worth bringing up. Ancient biographical traditions. Some ancient claims about Homer were established early and repeated often. They included that Homer was blind, taken as talking as self-referential passage describing the blind part. I see what they're talking about. So this is kind of the more fanciful version of his life, right? So saying that he was the son of a river and a nymph, it's interesting. But I wonder, sorry, maybe just read this wrong. Yeah, okay. So Homer was blind, his one claim. That's what his parents were allegedly. His occupation. Interesting. I see. That's where he died. I feel like I saw it also by fishermen. Interesting. So was that saying that he was the son of a river and a nymph? Too bad no nature. That's interesting. But I wonder. Sorry, I really don't want to have to read these, but I may. Yeah, whatever. In the early 4th century, Homer was expected to win, and all of this. Okay, I see. So this is basically the concept of Homer. In the early 4th century, Achaemenid composed a fictional account of the poetry contest at Thus, which boasts Homer and Hesiod. Homer was expected to win and answer all of Hesiod's questions and puzzles with ease. Then each of the poets was invited to recite the best passage from their work. Hesiod selected the beginning of Works of Days, which is fantastic, by the way, when the Pleiades put Atlas in all Homer was chosen. Homer chose in the early 4th description of Greek warriors and fictional account of the poetry contest. So the crowd claimed Homer was victor and a judge or Hesiod the prize expected to win. The poet who praised husbands with ease, then he said already as many who told tales of battle and slaughter, which is true. Hesiod, I don't mean to talk about him too much, but I did just finish the video on him, and I must say, some of his quotes really show what kind of a person he was, and even by modern day standards, he was brutally intelligent and wise, at least in a practical sense of the term, which is pretty good for a guy who spent most of his life living on a mountain battling slaughter. History of Homer scholarship. I don't mean to talk about the study of Homer is one of the oldest topics in scholarship, dating back to antiquity. Nothing less, the aims of Homeric studies have changed over the course of the millennia. The earliest preserved comments on Homer concern his treatment of the gods, which hostile critics the poet denounced as a moral allegorist. Study of Homer is one of the oldest topics. Allegorist, dating back to pronunciation. How the hell is this? Oh, I hate these videos. Is there like a Google? Of course there's not. I have to mute mine, aren't I? The earliest preserved comments on Homer concern his treatment of the gods, which hostile critics the poet denounced as a moral. Whatever, it'll be fine. Allegorist.
Allegorist or allegorist.
Oh shit, I'm pronouncing it right. Awesome. Algorist? Whatever. Google said it right. The algorist, or I don't know what else to say, however. Algorist, don't want to pronounce that, is said to have defended Homer. What is an algorist? A creator of... Oh, I see. Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier. I could have figured that out, actually. So, there are those who believe that that the Iliad and the Odyssey are meant to be taken literally, and there might be some truth to that, but an allegorist is one who searches for allegories, right? So, saying one thing while trying to get at another, basically, like saying, your chickens will come home to roost, or you reap what you sow. Those are all allegories. These are, well, some of them are platitudes, but allegories and platitudes, they can overlap. Is said to have defended Homer, arguing that Homer comes from allegories. Yeah, well, I should have read a little bit further. The Iliad and Odysseys were widely used as school texts in ancient Greek and Hellenistic cultures. My goodness. They were the first literary works taught to all students. The Iliad, particularly in its first few books, was far more intently studied than the Odyssey during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Interesting. I wonder why that is. Whatever. I'll have to read both of them first in their entirety. They're very long, by the way. Very, very long. I will likely have to do what I'm planning on doing with Works and Days and Theogony and just cover them in their own separate series and put it on Discord, I think. And then for download on Patreon as well. As a result of the poem's prominence in classical Greek education, extensive commentaries on them developed to explain parts of the poems that were culturally or linguistically difficult. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, many interpreters, especially the Stoics, who believed that Homeric poems conveyed Stoic doctrines, regarded them as allegories containing hidden wisdom, perhaps particularly because Homeric poems... because of the Homeric poems' extensive use in education. Many authors believe that Homer's original purpose had been to educate, and I would agree with that. I think that's the case with most poets, or with most writers in general, especially in ancient times. It is interesting. I wonder what the difference between an allegoric poem and a didactic poem would be. I feel like they're synonyms for each other. I feel like a didactic poem is just more blunt with its use of education, perhaps. Because Works and Days, and to an extent Theogony from Hesiod's works, is considered to be didactic. But Works and Days is literally almost a guide for how to live your life. At least in ancient times. A lot of it applies to the modern day, but it is what it is. Homer's wisdom became so widely praised that he began to require the image of almost a prototypical philosopher. Interesting. Byzantine scholars such as produced commentaries, extensions, and schola to Homer, especially in the 12th century. So this is, of course, well over 1,000 years after his death. I think it's a commentary on the Iliad alone is massive, sprawling over nearly 4,000 oversized pages. What? I gotta take a look at this. Really? Man, I really want to find a PDF of this. My goodness, 4,000. Whatever. Get on my. No, I want the whole thing. Downloads. See on there. Okay, so is that the thing? What do I download though? Is it this? I kind of just want to see it. So this is the same as what's on the website, right? I really don't want to buy this. I feel like buying something written about an author that existed 3,000 years ago is kind of silly. Can I just want to look at it though. But okay, well I think I clicked on everything I can click on. Okay. Hmm. Allow. I feel like I just sold my life away. I just want that. No. I don't care. Oh, there you go. Could you imagine being the poor son of a gun to purchase a commentary on a commentary? Man, oh, these people annoy me. No, I just want the one. Thank you. Skip, you bastard. Okay, well, let's see the size of this thing. Ooh, so it's not 4,000 pages, at least here, but is this like actually what it is? Please tell me this is in English. Oh man, is it? Maybe. I mean, that's in English for sure, but I don't know what any of this. These are just citations, are they not? But a lot of that. Oh, here we go. Okay, so it is in English. Cool, cool, cool. Introduction. Interesting. So I wonder. So this is like written like a paper would be, right? And they throw in the Greek as well. Was that fair? Probably for the citations of whatever he's commenting on, right? Like quoting almost, right? That's probably what it is. I'm really not gonna read this all tonight. There's no way I'd be able to. So, okay. So is this a commentary on a commentary? Because right, like it's supposed to be written by Estrios, right? But over here, so is the author commenting on the commentary as it's happening, kind of like providing his own 2 cents? I mean, I guess someone would have had to translate it, and it can be interesting. In any case, I'll get out of here for now. It is interesting to consider, though. Oh, I've been going about half an hour or so. Yeah, about half an hour. Well, I started it. Yeah, okay. I see. I have my tea with me here. But yeah, that might be worth looking into. Who was this guy, anyways? Yeah, Byzantine scholar, archbishop. Might be worth covering him as well. No, he doesn't really have a ton to him, I guess, maybe. He witnessed a siege, Constantinople, sure. And those are the commentaries. Interesting. So he's probably not worth covering at that point. Maybe in passing I'll bring him up. Kind of like give him a sentence or two in the actual video. Yeah, sure. And now let's get to the modern times. 1488. That guy, that Greek scholar. Oh my goodness. Published the Ethical Principles of the Homeric Poems, the earliest modern. The earliest modern Homeric scholars started with the same basic approaches towards the Homeric poems as scholars in antiquity. The allegorical interpretations of the Homeric poems that had been so prevalent in antiquity returned to become the prevailing view of the Renaissance. Renaissance humanists praised Homer as the archetypical wise poet, whose writings contained hidden wisdom, disguised through allegory. In Western Europe during the Renaissance, Virgil, who was the poet in Dante's Inferno, and the guide as well to some extent, was more widely read than Homer. Really, and Homer was often seen through Virgilian lenses. I see. Never mind. Wrong. Well, was this the same Virgil that was mentioned in Dante's Inferno? Or in the Divine Comedy, but yeah, it's within Dante's Inferno. Okay, so it is. Cool. So, in reality, he's... Whoa. That's impossible, because he predates Homer. Interesting. Quite a bit written about him, though. Maybe I will cover Virgil. Yeah, Dante's Divine Comedy. Interesting. I might cover Virgil. Here. I'll put him on the list. Virgil. I don't meet any Virgils anymore. Very uncommon name. Should be more common, though. What a badass name. No. I made a mistake. There we go. Sure. In any case, let's get back to Homer. I keep getting sidetracked. No. Maybe I'll leave it around. What was I? Modern, yeah. Renaissance, yeah, version, yeah, okay. In 1664, contracting the widespread praise of Homer as the epitome, weird word to read, epitome of wisdom, Francois Herden Abagdagat wrote a scathing attack on the Homeric poems. Interesting. Declaring they were incoherent, immoral, tasteless, without style, and that Homer never existed. Yeah, man, what a dick move, honestly. But, that just goes to show humans haven't really changed in recent times compared to ancient ones. It's very, ignorant, or the opposite, maybe. Well, not the opposite of ignorant, but it's just very crass to say as much. I hate it when people say that. Pet peeve. That Homer never existed, and that his poems were hastily cobbled together by incompetent editors from unrelated oral stories. 50 years later, the English scholar Richard Bentley concluded that Homer did exist, but that he was an obscure prehistoric oral poet whose compositions bear little relation to the Iliad and the Odyssey as they've been passed down. According to Bentley, Homer wrote a sequel of songs and rhapsodies to be sung by himself for small earnings and good cheer at festivals and other days of merriment. The Iliad he wrote for men, the Odysseus he wrote for the other sex. Interesting. The loose songs were not connected together in the form of an epic poem till Pisistratus' time, about 500 years later. What the heck is that supposed to mean? So Pisistratus was a ruler between 561 and 527 BC, so about 100 years or so after. Oh, about 100 years or so after Homer was kicking economics, culture improvements, blah, 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 blah. So he led Greece basically through a little bit of a cultural revolution. Very interesting. Very interesting. Lots written about it. Maybe worth covering in the future? Question mark. Weird name though. I wonder how the heck you even pronounce it. How do you pronounce that? Paste. Pronounce. Look at that. Google, you're learning.
Pisistratus.
Pisistratus. Pisistratus. Pisistratus. Hus. Pisistratus.
Pisistratus.
Pisistratus. Interesting. That's probably good to know. Pisistratus. What an interesting name. Well, anyways. Yes. Pisistratus. Friedrich August Wolff's Primigale ad hominem, published in 1795, argued that much of the material later incorporated into the Iliad and Odyssey was originally composed in the 10th century BC. Interesting. In the form of short, separate oral songs, which passed down through oral tradition for roughly 400 years before assembling into prototypical versions of the Iliad and Odyssey in the 6th century BC by literary authors. After being written down, Wolff maintained that the two poems were extensively edited, modernized, and eventually reshaped into the present state as artistic unities. Wolff and the Analyst school, which led the field in the 19th century, sought to recover original, authentic poems that were thought to be concealed by later excrucities. I see. Within the Analyst school, two camps were formed. Proponents of the lay theory, which held that the Iliad and Odyssey were put together from a large number of short, independent songs, and proponents of the nucleus theory, which held that Homer had originally composed shorter versions of the Iliad and Odyssey until later poets expanded on and revised. A small group of scholars opposed to the Analysts, dubbed Unitarians, saw the later editions as superior, the work of a single inspired poet. By around 1830, the central preoccupation of the Homeric scholars, leading with whether or not Homer actually existed, when and how the Homeric poems were related, how they were transmitted, when and how they were finally written down, their overall unity had been dubbed the Homeric question. What a pain. Following World War I, the Analyst school began to fall out of favor amongst Homeric scholars. It did not die out entirely, but became increasingly seen as discredited, dead end. Starting around 1928, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, after their studies of folk bards in the Balkans, developed the oral formulaic theory. And the Homeric poems were originally composed through improvised oral performances, which relied on the traditional epithet and poetic formulas. This theory found very wide scholarly acceptance and explained many of the previous puzzling features of the Homeric poems, including their unusual, archaic language, their extensive use of stock epithets, and their other repetitive features. Many scholars conclude that the Homeric question had finally been answered. I see. Interesting. But I mean, I don't really, maybe I'm just being silly here, but would that answer much, like any of the Homeric question? So the Homeric question is basically 4 parts, right? So part 1, whether or not Homer actually existed. Okay. Part 2, when and how the Homeric poems originated. 3, how they were transmitted. And 4, how they were actually written down. I see. So the oral formulaic theory here really doesn't answer the first part. Doesn't really deal with whether or not Homer actually existed. It does answer how they originated, claiming it was oral theories, or oral stories were kind of passed down, popular stories basically. And that would also answer how they were transmitted. It doesn't really bring up when and how they were finally written down, though. So it answers half of the homework question, but that's probably the easiest half to answer, is it not? Interesting. Meanwhile, the neo-analysts sought to bridge the gap between the analysts and the Unitarians. The neo-analysts sought to trace the relationship between Homeric poems and other epic poems which have now been lost, but which many modern scholars do possess to some patchy knowledge. The neo-analysts hold that the knowledge of earlier versions of the epics can be derived from anomalies of structure and details of the surviving versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These anomalies point to earlier versions of the Iliad, in which Ajax played a more prominent role, in which the Archelaean embassy to Achilles was comprised of different characters, in which Praxiteles was actually mistaken for Achilles by the Trojans. They point to earlier versions of the Odyssey, in which Terminus, Telemachus, my goodness, went in search of news of his father, not to Malinus in Sparta, but to this guy in Crete, which Telemachus met up with the father. Blah, 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 blah. I see. So there is some discrepancy between versions, but that makes sense, as, you know, back in those days, they didn't really have a printing press, so even the written down versions would have been at the mercy of the person writing them. And, you know, people, when they write for long periods of time, they kind of get in their little groove. So I could imagine there being some discrepancies. How interesting. Most contemporary scholars, they all disagree on the questions of the genus of poems. They agree that the authors are not produced by the same author, are based on many different narrative matter. Yeah, I see. So they're basically claiming that they were a collection of authors. But that's true for most epics, right? Especially in ancient Greece. Maybe even regardless, right? Interesting. Very, very interesting. Philosopher generally agreed that each poem is composed mostly by a single author. Oh my goodness, guys. Oh, I'm getting tired. I'll probably, how long have we been doing this for? Me reading isn't the problem, it's me reading and speaking that's kind of the issue. Also, it's like literally nobody in chat right now, so I'm not really too worried about it. I'll probably go for another 15-ish minutes, I'm thinking. And then after that, we'll probably wrap things up, right? Yeah, I think it'll work good. Man, my mic is very, very sensitive. Let me think here. I'm gonna listen to myself for half a second here. Also, it's like literally nobody in chat right now, so I'm not really too worried about it. I'll probably go for another 15-ish minutes, I'm thinking. And then after that, we'll probably wrap things up, right? Yeah, I think it'll work good. Yeah, and my mic. I see. Whatever, it'll be fine. Not too worried about it. Man, am I tired. I had a long day at work today, guys. We're kind of setting everything up for one of our bigger events of the year, and it's such a pain in the neck. Not to say I find work exhausting. I enjoy the people I work with. I enjoy the job I have. Always lots of laughs, right? But it still takes a decent amount out of you, especially when you come home and read, basically, Wikipedia articles. It's not very good. Most contemporary scholars, though they disagree on the question, yes, I see. All scholars agree that the Iliad and the Odyssey are unified poems, in that each poem shows a clear overall design, I see, and that you're not merely strung together from unrelated songs. I see. It is also generally agreed on that each poem was comprised mostly by a single author. Interesting. Who probably relied heavily on older oral traditions, and nearly all scholars agree that the Desdemona in Book 10 of the Iliad is not part of the original poem, but a later assertion from a different poet. Okay, I see. It's an interesting discussion, to say the least. Some ancient scholars believe that Homer to have been an eyewitness to the Trojan War. But interesting. A blind eyewitness. I feel like there's a joke there somewhere. Others thought they had lived up to 500 years afterwards. Interesting. Contemporary scholars continue to debate the date of the poems. Along the history of oral traditions lies a long history of oral traditions lies beneath the composition of the poems, complicating the search of a precise date, of course. At one extreme, Richard Janko has proposed a date for both poems to be the 8th century BC because based on linguistic analysis and statistics. Interesting. Barry B. Powell dates the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey to be sometime between 800 and 750 BC, which hypothetically is about the same time as Hesiod, based on the statement of Herodotus, who lived in the late 5th century BC, that Homer lived 400 years before his own time, and not more. I see. And on the fact that the poems do not mention hoplite battle tactics, inhumation, or literacy. Burial, I see. Inhumation, I see. It's a method of final decomposition, whereby a dead body is placed into a ground, sometimes with objects. This is usually accomplished by excavating a pit or trench placed on the deceased object. Over, I see. Ooh. Martin Litchfield West, what a baddest name, has argued that the Iliad echoes the poetry of Hesiod. Interesting. That may have been composed around 600 to 650 BC at the earliest, with the Odyssey up to a generation later. Interesting. He interprets a passage in the Iliad showing knowledge historical events occurring in the ancient Near East during the middle of the 7th century BC. Including the destruction of Babylon by whoever that is in 689 BC, and the sack of Thebes in 663 to 664 BC. At the other extreme, a few American scholars, such as Gregory Nagri, see Homer as a continually evolving tradition, which grew much more stable in the tradition progressed, but which did not fully cease to continue changing and evolving until, as of the middle of the 2nd century BC. I see, so like 500 years later, basically. Homer is a name of unknown epitical or etymological. Jesus, what a hard word. Etymological origin, around which many theories were erected in antiquity, and one such linkage was to the Greek hostage, or I see. The explanation suggested by modern scholars, which tend to mirror their position of the overall Homer question. Nagy interprets it as he who fits together. I see. So there are, I don't know, maybe half a dozen different schools of thought about Homer and his works. How interesting. At least half a dozen primary ones. What a pain You see, Hesiod didn't really have to worry about this many complications because the guy included himself in his own works, which is a very strange thing for an author to do, by the way, even in modern times. It's very rare to find an author bold enough to put himself in his own work. Many consider it to be a like pride or vainful thing to do, but man, I think it's pretty ballsy. Historicity of the Homeric epics and Homeric society. Man, we're only about no, we're pretty much done this. I see lots of citations, which is fine. I may need to burn through some of these. Oh well. Check the wiki quotes as well. Anyways, let's finish up on Homer. At least for the wiki. Where was we? Here. Scholars continue to debate the questions whether or not the Trojan War actually took place. Ooh, and if so, when and where, and to what extent society depicted Homer has been based off of his own, and to what extent the society depicted by Homer is based on his own, or which was, even at the time of the poem's composition, known only as legends. The Homeric epics are largely set in the east and center of the Mediterranean, with some scattered references to Egypt, Ethiopia, and other distant lands, and a warlike society that resembles that of the Greeks' world slightly before the hypothesized date of the poem's composition. Interesting. Well, I mean, I guess that fits with a lot of the schools of thought surrounding his work, so it's not really all that out of place, but it is kind of strange to read it laid out like that. Interesting. It kind of like blows away the whole eyewitness account story, though, which makes sense, especially if he's a guy hard of sight, a blind eyewitness. Could you imagine such a thing? It's kind of, I'm sure it might have happened to some extent already, but there's a joke there somewhere, you know. In ancient Greek chronology, the sack of Troy was dated to about 1200 BC. By the 19th century, there was widespread scholarly skepticism that the Trojan War ever happened and that Troy had even existed. Ooh. By 1873, Heinrich Schliemann announced to the world that he had discovered the ruins of Homer's Troy, a historic in modern Turkey. Some contemporary scholars think the destruction of Troy was about 12, or closer to about a little bit before they thought, was the origin of the myth of the Trojan War. Others, that the poem was inspired by multiple similar sieges that took place over the centuries. Interesting. Most scholars now agree that the Homeric poems depict customs and elements of the material world that derive from different periods of Greek history. Okay, for instance, the heroes in the poems use bronze weapons. Okay, that makes sense. Characteristic of the Bronze Age, in which the poems were set, rather than the Iron Age, during which they were composed. Very interesting. Yet the same heroes are cremated, an Iron Age practice, rather than buried, which is a Bronze Age tactic. I see. Interesting. That is a funny little discrepancy between the two, isn't it? I mean, you could make the argument that they're kind of minor details, like they're not really meant to be focused on. But the fact that there is a discrepancy would make sense if it was passed down orally, right? Like, even now, when I imagine bronze weapons, I do kind of view them in a more, I guess, heroistic light. Like a bronze sword it's kind of cool, An iron sword is probably more effective, but it's not as cool, right? As far as cremation goes, I don't really have much of a strong opinion on that, but I guess at the time it might have made a cultural difference, like perhaps only those from aristocratic or royal families are cremated, like it's a sign of status and death, perhaps. Interesting. In some parts of the Homeric poems, heroes are described as carrying large shields like those used by the warriors of the Macedonian period, but in other places they are instead described as carrying the similar shields that was commonly used during the time of the poems were written during the Iron Age. The Iliad, Odysseus is described as wearing a helmet made of boar's tusks. Such helmets were not worn in Homer's time, but were commonly worn by aristocratic warriors between 1600 and 1200 BC. Interesting. Very interesting. I see. So, based on all of that, I believe that Homer would be more like a collector, an organizer of stories, rather than a teller of all of them, which is still noble, don't get me wrong, but it does kind of cast it all in a different light. The Discernment of Linear B in the 1950s by Michael Ventris, and continued archaeological investigation has increased modern scholars' understanding of the Argelian civilization, which in many ways resemble the ancient Near East more than the society described by Homer. Some aspects of the Homeric world are simply made up. For instance, the Iliad describes there being two springs that run near the city of Troy. One that runs steaming hot, and the other that runs icing cold. It is here Hector takes his final stand against Achilles. Archaeologists, however, have uncovered no evidence that springs in this description ever actually existed. Yeah, I think that could be chalked up to allegory, though, where hot and cold meet. It's kind of like the duality of man in some sense or another, and that would make sense for you to take your final stand. It's very much painting the scene, I believe you could call it. Style and language. This is the second last part. The Homeric epics are written in an artificial literary language. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Only used in an epic hexameter poetry. Homeric Greek shows features of multiple regional Greek dialects and periods, but is fundamentally based on Ionic Greek, and in keeping with the tradition that Homer was from Iona. Linguist analysts suggest that the Iliad was composed slightly before the Odyssey. Then that makes sense, I guess. Yeah. The Homeric formula preserves older features rather than other parts of the poem. The poem, composed in rhyming dialect hexameter, ancient Greek meter, was quantity based rather than stress based. Interesting. Homer frequently uses set phrases such as epitomes, crafty Odysseus, rose-fingered Dawn, owl-eyed Athena, etc. Homeric formulae, an answer to him, her, Agamemnon, capable of this. I see, okay. Simile, type scenes, ring composition, repetition. These habits aid the extemporizing bard, and are characteristic of oral poetry. For instance, I see what they're saying. So it's almost like the poems in the Iliad and Odyssey were meant to be spoken orally. They weren't necessarily meant to be read. I see. Because you would change the cadence of your voice when fluctuating between, oh my goodness, why am I blanking on words today? Adjectives and nouns and verbs, right? So, rosy-fingered Dawn. You'd change your cadence. Owl-eyed Athena. Thus they spoke. Yeah, I see what they're saying. Yeah, I guess if you were intending to write poetry that was meant to be read and not spoken, you would likely not use vocabulary like that. Interesting. Whereas poets like Virgil or Milton, I'm looking forward to covering Milton, by the way. use instance, the main words of Homer concentration. Yes. Yeah, okay. So that makes sense. So the main words in Homeric sentences are generally placed in the beginning, which makes sense because when you see a lot of screenwriters do the same thing, or a lot of maybe not screenwriters, but a lot of people who write like plays, right? Those are screenwriters, aren't they? Anyways, doesn't matter. They will even in dramas, right? They kind of say the most important thing at the beginning to grab the audience's attention, whereas a lot of complicated written works, they don't really have to do that, because if you're reading it, they already have your attention, and if you overstimulate the audience too much when they're reading a long form body of work, it wouldn't make you'd become desensitized to it. But if you were listening to somebody recite it, it would give the person reciting it a chance to kind of flex their storytelling muscle, as it were. Interesting. I actually think it's a clever technique. How cool. How absolutely fascinating. Like, could you imagine? Like, this is like very much almost like an Indian drama. It's like you're talking about, I don't know, something fairly small, right? It's like, let's say you're talking about like two farmers talking about the harvest, but at the end of the sentence before it ends, it's like, but Hades had other plans for the farmers. And then it ends. Like, what a cliffhanger, right? Like, to name drop at the beginning and then allude to something at the end is a very powerful technique. How cool. How cool. Homer then expands on those ideas in subsequent clauses. Yeah, literally what I just talked about. So it's called for parataxis. I see. How cool. The so-called type scenes were named by Walter Adorn in 1993. He noted that Homer often, when describing frequently recurring activities such as eating, praying, fighting, dressing, used blocks of set phrases in sequence and elaborated by the poet. Interesting. The analyst school considered these repetitions as un-Homeric, or Arend interpreted them as philosophically. Perry and Lord noted that these conversations are found in many other cultures. I mean, I guess that makes sense. If you're telling a story and you're trying to make it as real as possible, you have to talk about those things. But if they're not particularly pertaining to the story you're talking about, you'd have to have a way to gloss them over. Especially if you're at a point in time where everything was being handwritten, right? It wouldn't make... it might be... I don't know if such a thing would be intentionally done by Homer during his first draft, but certainly as the Iliad and the Odyssey became more prominent, you would have to do something like that. Not just for the sake of the poor writer's wrist, but also for the sake of the reader as well. That'd be like a first draft, second draft, third draft thing. It's very... If you're drafting properly and if you're writing properly, your first draft will always be longer than your second draft, because your second draft, you'll remove the things you really don't need and you'll shorten and tighten up the sentences. How strange. So that might explain it, right? I don't know. Makes sense to me, at least. Ring compositions or churistic structure when phrase or idea is reported. Okay. When a phrase or idea is repeated at both the beginning and end of a story, or a series of such ideas first appear in order ABC before reversing a CBA. Okay. Has been observed in the Homeric epics. Opinions differ as to whether or not these occurrences are conscious artistic devices or a mnemonic aid or a spontaneous feature of human storytelling. I mean, it would have to be. It seems like a strange thing to coincidentally happen, right? Both of the Homeric poems begin with an invocation to the muse. In the Iliad, the poet beseeches her to sing of anger of Achilles, and in the Odyssey, he asks for her to tell the many ways of, or the man of many ways. Oh, I see. A similar opening was later employed by Virgil in his Menende. I mean, it could just be common, though. Maybe that's what they're talking about as a spontaneous feature of human storytelling, but would it be mnemonic 8 at that point? I wonder, because Theogony by Hesiod kind of starts the same way, but muses are like natural storytellers for the gods, so maybe it's just a cultural thing. How interesting. And it's a good way to lend credence to your work without necessarily throwing yourself under the bus, because it's not Homer saying these things happen. It's Homer recording what the muses are saying, right? It's a literary technique that's been used tons of times, often when talking about things that the author could get in trouble for. An extreme example would be when in Galileo Galilei tried to write a book criticizing the church by having 3 hypothetical characters talk to each other. It wasn't Galileo criticizing the church, it was these 3 hypothetical people that didn't really exist, right? It didn't turn out too well for him in the end, but it was still a clever idea. Textual transmission. The orally transmitted Homer poems were put into written form at some point between the 8th and 6th century BC. Okay. Some scholars believe that they were dedicated to a scribe by the poet, and that other inherited versions of the Iliad and Odyssey were in origin orally dictated texts, which is probably true. Albert Lord noted that the Balkan bards that he was studying revised and expanded their songs in the process of dictating. Some scholars hypothesized that a similar process of revision and expansion occurred when the Homeric poems were first written down. Yes, I will agree with that. Other scholars hold that after the poem were created in the 8th century, they continued to be orally transmitted with considerable revisions until they were written down in the 6th century. After textualization, the poems were each divided into 24 rhapsodies, today referred to as books, and labeled by the letters of the Greek alphabet. Many scholars attribute to the book division to the Hellenistic scholars of Alexandria and Egypt. Some trace the divisions back further to the classical period. Very few credit Homer himself with the divisions. Yeah, of course. It wouldn't make sense for him to compose 2 full poems and then split them. The only time you'd want to split it would be if the cover of the original material was too much. But the only people who would do that would be people trying to break down the original material, unless there was a long span of time or some kind of narrative break, like a chapter. Then it might make sense to group them into books. But for the most part, I couldn't imagine an ancient Greek doing that. I don't know, maybe. It's one of those, I wasn't there, obviously, but it does make sense that it would happen after the fact. Although it might have happened earlier, it might have made sense to do that during maybe even during Homer's life. It might not have been his choice per se, but it would make sense to write them down in chunks. Maybe what each scribe could do in a day would be considered a rhapsody. Maybe. That would make sense too. Interesting. Whatever. In antiquity, it was widely held that the Homeric poems were collected and organized in Athens in the late 6th century BC by the tyrant the same guy I tried to talk about earlier. I can't remember. I think I have the tab open still. This guy.
Pisistratus.
Pisistratus. Thank you, nice voice lady. Pisistratus. By the tyrant Pisistratus. No, tyrant. Maybe, I don't know, whatever. Did I put him on the thing? I think I put him on the thing, didn't I? Pisistratus? Right there. Cool. Where was I? Where's Pisistratus? There it is. In which Subscene scholars have dubbed this the Pisistratian recession. The idea that the Homeric poems were originally transmitted orally, first written down during the reign of Pisistratus, referred to by the 1st century BC Roman orientator whatever. This guy. And also referred to by a number of other surviving sources, including the 2 ancient lives of Homer. From around 150 BC, the texts in Homeric poems seem to have become relatively established after the establishment of the Library of Alexandria. Homeric scholars, such as Zenodotus of Athenia, oh my goodness, my poor brain is melting, guys. And that person particularly, helped establish canonical texts. I mean, I really don't want to have to learn these people's names. Such complicated names. The first printed... My goodness, I got Speed Racer in the background. Whatever. The first printed edition of Homer was produced by 1488 in Milan, Italy. That's cool. It's Milan, darling. Today, scholars use medieval manuscripts, papyri, and other sources, and some argue for a multi-text view rather than seeking a single definitive text. Interesting. 9th century edition of our blah, blah, blah. I see. And I mean, that makes sense. As different people write them down and record them, they're likely to make changes just for ease of the reader, but those changes, over time at least, can have pronounced effects on the actual work in question. How interesting. Homer, my friend, you've lived quite the fascinating life. I still have all of these to read, but these are all much shorter. The Wikipedia article is a good place to start. It's kind of like a catch-all, right? And then you read what other people have written about him in shorter form. Then you can use that to discern what the important bits are from the non-important bits. And then I'll work on a script after that. In any case, guys, I'm pretty spent. I'm going to probably let her go for the night here. Get some sleep. I work early tomorrow anyways. And then chip on. So if you're watching this after the fact, thank you for putting up with my low energy right now. I promise as this becomes a habit, my body will naturally allocate more kind of energy to this task, but whatever, still a good place to start. In any case, hope you guys have a good night. Thanks for watching, and